Percy Mark was born in Austria and came over to Britain when he was 14. He qualified as an architect in 1959, worked in Nigeria for 18 months, and then spent 6 months with Albert Schweitzer in Lamborghini, where he met his wife, Rennie. And so this is a marvelous thing to have someone here who actually met Albert Schweitzer and could say that he knew more of us just studied his books, but here is someone who really can say something about the man. After this, he pursued his career as an architect and also engaged in private research in music and visual proportions, lecturing on the subject in schools and universities in Britain and South Africa. In 1995, he took over the chairmanship of the UK charity Dr. Schweitzer's Hospital Fund, as it was then called, visiting and supporting charitable projects in India, Tanzania, as well as the United Kingdom. He lectured on Reverence for Life in schools in the United Kingdom. Since giving up his chairmanship of what is now called Reverence for Life UK, he has worked on and completed a translation of Schweitzer's third volume of Culture and Ethics, entitled The Worldview of Reverence for Life. And it's a pleasure to have Percy here, and he's going to speak on the question, issues surrounding the non-completion of volumes 3 and 4, to which Professor Kirtner referred in his first lecture. So thank you very much, Percy.
I'm going to talk about just a little bit about how I got into all this, and then what we know about volumes 3 and 4, and then the reasons which prevented the completion of volume 3, what the central stumbling block was for that non-completion, and what all that means for us today. So how did I get into all this? It was in the autumn of 1962 when I arrived at Schweitzer's Hospital in Lamborghini, aged 26. You can see me there on the left. I knew about the hospital because I had lived for several months in the house of my American half-uncle by marriage, Fergus Pope, who is on the right there. He had been to Lamborghini and was studying medicine in London at the time in order to go back to Lamborghini as a doctor. I learned a great deal from him, but he was a man of action, and I cannot remember ever discussing Schweitzer's philosophy with him. Thus, when I spent 6 months under Schweitzer's roof, so to speak, I had not read anything he had written. I didn't even know he was a philosopher and a theologian. I only knew him as a medical doctor and a very exceptional man of action, with a very powerful and endearing personality and character. By the way of 3 little anecdotes, let me give you a taste of what contact with this man was like for me. At our first meeting, within seconds of stepping off the canoe on the river's edge, taking my hand and looking straight into my eyes, he asked what my plans were. No hello, no welcome, just what are your plans, young man? Upon answering that at that moment I had none, he called out, aha, a free man. I was totally taken aback, but I was transported into eons of what it might mean to be truly free. And the experiences remained with me for the rest of my life. Then, on occasions, when I had to ask him something, whilst he was sitting at his desk like this, his hand would stop mid-word when he became aware that I was standing behind him. And as he turned to face me, after the brief conversation, and they were always brief conversations, he would continue writing instantly, as if there had been no interruption. This demonstration of living in the moment is also unforgettable. I wish I could do it. And finally, one day, as he and I were walking to the dining hall at lunchtime, I summoned up courage to ask him to release his catering manager from her 3-year contract because I wanted to marry her. He took my arm, asked me a few questions, and then commented, "You have good taste, young man, I give you that." But I had had the feeling that during our short conversation, my whole life had been examined, and I was left with a certainty that I had made a good decision. We have just celebrated our diamond wedding anniversary 2 weeks ago. I don't know where she is. She's there.
Just behind the slide.
It would be wrong, however, to say that I was not interested in philosophy at that time, because I had read quite a bit of ancient Indian philosophy and some Plato, and the books of Goethe's poems were my constant companions. But none of that ever came up between Schweitzer and myself. So now let me jump half a century to 2010. By then, I had been chairman of a charity supporting Schweitzer's work in the UK for 15 years. I had read much of Schweitzer's published philosophical work, which was very hard for me, not being an academic and not having been trained in philosophy. Some of it in the original German, including the unfinished volume of his Philosophy of Civilization, unfinished volume 3 of his Philosophy of Civilization, which was not then known to the English-speaking world. This last work left me with a strong feeling that important unfinished business lay behind, hidden in the fact that Schweitzer had been unable to complete this part of his major philosophical project. So I had a sense that there was something really important in that fact. So I don't wish to interrupt you. It had also dawned on me what a huge significance lay in the fact that for Schweitzer, ethics had to be an essential ingredient of any definition of the concept of civilization, even though the word ethics did not appear in any dictionary definition of the word civilization that I could find. I had also realized what a radical thinker Schweitzer really was. And it strengthened my resolve, even though I had no adequate qualification for the task, except that I'm sufficiently bilingual, to make the essential contents of Volume 3 accessible to the English-speaking world. Assisted by an extensive correspondence with the collator and joint editor of all of Schweitzer's unpublished written legacy, Dr. Johannes Zürcher in Switzerland, it took me 10 years to complete the task. Yeah, so these two books, which you see there, are the result. As the work was nearing completion, I was advised that the book would be too large for publishers and that I should split it into two, which I did. It didn't help in finding a publisher. I had to self-publish via Amazon, but I live in hope. So what then do we know about volumes 3 and 4? Let me deal with volume 4 first, as it takes us back to the very beginning. You've heard this already in the first presentation that was made today. But Schweitzer tells us that in the summer of 1899, he was in Berlin at a party where someone exclaimed, "So we are all nothing but epigones." And that sentence struck him like a bolt of lightning, because it put into words exactly what he felt. It made him realize how very out of tune with the spirit of the age he really was, and that he could not share the general euphoria about the so-called achievements of that time. The young professor saw nothing but dark storm clouds gathering on the horizon and was acutely aware of a general decline in idealism amongst his fellow academics. And it was since that day that he harbored the plan to write a philosophy of civilization. However, other pressing matters, however, other pressing and momentous decisions, like abandoning his academic career, studying medicine, and going to Africa, not to mention all his work on J.S. Bach, etc., took precedence until August the 5th, 1914. That is, when the news reached Lamborghini that Europe was at war. That same evening, the Schweitzers were put under house arrest. And the next day, he started work on the philosophy of civilization. He soon realized that since the dark clouds had arrived and the storm was raging over Europe, it was no longer enough to warn of impending doom. Positive statements had to be made. But what could be said? Then in September 1915 came the momentous experience, his momentous experience, when in a moment of inspiration, the search for answers crystallized in the words Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben, not very well translated as reverence for life. The parameters of his project vastly expanded, and he began to see it in the 4 distinct volumes of which we now know. Volumes 1 and 2 were published in 1923, as we've heard today, and these have been discussed in depth so far. But they were written in the early 1920s in Europe, because the bundle of manuscript pages which Schweitzer had written in Lamborghini was thought to have been lost when the Schweitzers were moved to an internment camp in France in 1917. However, this bundle did eventually reappear, and its contents have been published in 2005 under the title Wir begonnen. And we can see
No, it's the next one.
Yes, we can see from just from looking at some of the chapter headings. You can see the idea of statehood, or you can read them on the screen. That in his mind, in Schweitzer's mind, he had consigned much of what he had drafted then in Lamborghini to his planned volume 4, which he had intended to call Der Kulturstaat, the civilized nation state. However, volume 4 was never started. Dr. Zürcher had sent me all the notes specifically earmarked for volume 4, which had been found after Schweitzer's death. And these don't amount to more than 1.5 pages of A4. This then is what we know about the material of volume 4. However, looking at these chapter headings and imagining just for a moment, yes, imagining just for a moment what Schweitzer could have produced by applying the ethos of reverence for life to these subjects, we can get a sense of what has been lost to humankind through the blockage which caused volume 3 to remain unfinished. This is the point. There was a blockage. We didn't finish volume 3 and never started volume 4. So is it possible for us to remove that blockage now? Back to volume 3 then. I thought it would be helpful at this point to remind ourselves briefly of the conditions in which Schweitzer worked at his writings. This was the house in which Schweitzer had his rooms. They were the two end rooms at this end. And this is him sitting at his desk in his study bedroom. These were written on scraps of paper and bundled together with bits of string. Paper clips would rust in a matter of days. Backs of letters were used and envelopes opened up and flattened. He wasn't tapping into a computer, but dipping his pen into an inkpot. But much of his writing was done during his travels. In all, he made 14 journeys to Lamborghini and 13 back, because of course he was buried there. 5 of these return journeys were made during the period of working on volume 3, and all of them on ships. He looked forward to these times on board ship as opportunities for undisturbed and concentrated work. Work on volume 3 began in Lamborghini in the spring of 1931, 8 years after the publication of volumes 1 and 2. Then in November 33, he put aside what he had written, and in January 34, he started again from the beginning. And this happened 4 times, so that 4 separate versions were found after his death. Sections on Indian and Chinese thought were hived off into separate volumes because they grew too large. The volume on Indian thought was published in 1935. The volume on the history of Chinese thought was published as part of the whole.
Hang on, so sorry.
As part, yeah, you can.
Yep, you're ready to go.
As part of the whole series of 10 volumes of Schweitzer's posthumously published works, which we see here. So this is all stuff that was published after Schweitzer was found. Thousands and thousands of pages of manuscripts were found. Johannes Zürcher and others edited and collated this material and produced these 10 publications. So what was it that prevented the completion of volume 3? Many reasons, mainly blaming other priorities, have been put forward. He was, after all, running a large hospital under extremely challenging conditions, raising all the funding for this himself through lectures, organ recitals, and his published writings, as well as maintaining a huge correspondence with leading politicians, scientists, and supporters all over the globe. There were rooms about the size of this space, full of potato bags, full of letters, unopened letters when I was there. The correspondence was unbelievable. And there was a whole team, all the nurses, everybody was helping to read these letters, open them, then draft replies. He would sign, he would read and sign all the replies. But it was a huge task. Not to mention his contribution in the early 1950s to the protest against atomic tests of that period, and his being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which gave him the opportunity to speak on Oslo radio about the problems of peace in the world, which was incidentally the first ever broadcast relayed live right around the globe. Throughout that period, many people tried to persuade him to publish volume 3, but he steadfastly refused. All these reasons, however, may explain why he did not return to this work during the years between 1946 and his death in 1965. But they do not explain why there had to be 4 separate runs at it. Whilst immersed in the translation, it began to dawn on me that there might be other than practical considerations why 4 separate starts had to be made. Something seemed to be preventing Schweitzer from bringing his argument to a satisfactory conclusion. The challenge was to come up with a new worldview in which the ethic of reverence for life, arrived at as the inevitable result of fundamental thought, taken to its natural conclusion, was firmly embedded. In this way, Schweitzer planned to lay a firm foundation in thought on which to complete, to use his analogy, the construction of his dome in the form of volume 4, The Cultured Nation State. So what was the insuperable stumbling block? Whilst I was pondering this question, 2 things occurred. I began to realize that each time Schweitzer came to a stop, he was struggling with the chapter on ethics. He had described what he called the realities of nature, how nature was bred in tooth and claw, as the Darwinians had put it. And he was faced with demonstrating how ethics came into the picture. And somehow he couldn't make that work. And then, just as this was beginning to dawn on me, I attended the 2014 prize giving of the International Albert Schweitzer Prize awarded by the town of Königsfeld in Germany, where the main guest speaker was the then president of the German Hilfsverein, Dr. Einhard Weber. And his topic was Schweitzer and Goethe. You can imagine how my attention was galvanized when I heard Dr. Weber quoting Schweitzer, speaking about Goethe's worldview. So this is Schweitzer talking about Goethe, and I quote, "If we ask Goethe how ethics arise out of nature, the answer we get from him is very simple. Goethe was deeply convinced of the process of evolution in nature right up to and including humankind. Humans for Goethe are a piece of nature. And as soon as humans rise up to fully embrace true ethics, something new appears in nature, a higher dimension, a new possibility. The spiritual journey of humankind is not something isolated and on its own, but is a movement within the evolution of the whole of nature." Unquote. I could hardly believe my ears. How could Schweitzer express this so clearly in a talk about Goethe, and yet not carry it over into his own philosophy of civilization? Let's just look at these sentences again, because they hold the key to my whole argument. So, Goethe was deeply convinced of the process of evolution in nature right up to and including humankind. Humans for Goethe are a piece of nature. As soon as humans rise up to fully embrace true ethics, something new appears in nature, a higher dimension, a new possibility. The spiritual journey of humankind is not something isolated and on its own, but is a movement within the evolution of the whole of nature. Puzzled as I was, I researched this further at home and found that Schweitzer had given 4 talks on Goethe. You can see them here. Dr. Weber's quotation, which we have just looked at, came from the second talk. In his first talk in Frankfurt, Schweitzer said, and I quote, "The big problem for all natural philosophers, for Goethe, as for the Stoics, for Spinoza and Lao Tse, is this: how to deduce ethical values from nature. Goethe takes a very simple path here. He pays no attention to all the derivations and proofs his contemporaries tried, but simply accepts the ethical ideas which have arisen in humankind as natural manifestations." Unquote. But in his third talk in Ulm, also in 1932, Schweitzer gives us an inkling of the problem which he himself faced. And I quote once more. "Thought, in order to come to a complete worldview, cannot be satisfied with a knowledge of what is apparent and discernible, but has to seek answers to questions about invisible things, like the meaning and purpose of the world. But here Goethe undertakes something reprehensible. In his view, humankind is far too insignificant to be able to give meaning and purpose to the world. Whilst the others, Goethe's contemporaries, insist on the necessity for this in order to be able to make sense of their ethical behavior in the world, Goethe has no need for the assignation of meaning and purpose to the world. According to him, we humans have to be ethical out of inner conviction. No thing in the world is purpose for some other purpose or means for some other end. But the things of this world are purpose unto themselves. Thus, we humans can dispense with the task of having to fathom out the meaning and purpose of the world. The point of life for humans is to develop the good that is in each individual and to resist the evil which obstructs that development, unquote. In this passage, Schweitzer is telling us that what Goethe thought about this was reprehensible. For Schweitzer, Goethe was ducking the issue here. Somehow, Schweitzer needed more. It seems to me that we have now found the blockage. Schweitzer could not bring himself to be satisfied with Goethe's resignation regarding the question of a complete worldview, that he could not let go of the idea of somehow the justification for ethics had to be derived from a purpose attributed to this whole vast show, and that no foundation in thought could be established for ethics without this. But he could not find such a derivation. And even though he drew attention on several occasions to the minuscule size of the earth on the universal scale, Goethe's more humble view did not seem to suffice. I just love this slide. I put it in to remind us where we are, where we live, and to give Goethe his due. I do not want to insinuate that the way Goethe dealt with this question was not sufficiently rigorous for Schweitzer personally. But he was in search of firm ground that would withstand the onslaughts of his time. He felt that this foundation had to be laid on scientifically substantiated facts drawn from the observable universe. This is particularly evident in his last of the four versions, where he grapples with the latest scientific research, mainly in biology. Furthermore, Schweitzer had blamed the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment for not having laid a sufficiently firm foundation then for the ethical ideals, leaving them incapable of withstanding the challenges which were to come during the Industrial Revolution of the scientific era, thus ushering in the decline of Western civilization, which he experienced so intensely. Therefore, he saw it as his task to do better than that. I have tried to demonstrate that the blockage was not a lack of recognition of how ethics arise in our universe, namely that humankind is nature's instrument for bringing ethics into the evolutionary process of life on Earth. He eloquently expressed this on Goethe's behalf, but that he could not bring himself to formulate the arguments necessary to build this into a foundation which would have traction and find acceptability amongst the scientific materialism of his time. So, in my view, that was his real problem. That's what he was stuck on. He couldn't bring himself to argue the case in such a way that the scientific world of the time would be satisfied. What does all this mean for us today? There are those of us who, in order to make sense of things, find it imperative to recognize the limitations of the currently dominant, abstract, materialistic, scientific basis for formulating a worldview. We have to go beyond its restrictive authority. Are we not confronted daily with the stark reality into which this worldview has brought not only us humans, but all of life on this globe? We know that whilst this view has its place in exploring, describing, and manipulating physical matter, it is only part of the story. For us, a firm foundation for a worldview must of necessity be based on the totality of our experience, including not only the attributes of solid physical matter, but also embracing the subtle energies and spiritual causes which govern life on Earth. And these cannot function without ethics, as is becoming evident daily. Of course, Schweitzer knew all this, which is why he raised the alarm. But in addition, now, 77 years later, because he stopped working on volume 3 in 1946, we have a greater awareness of the worldviews, beliefs, and attitudes of indigenous and aboriginal cultures than was available in Schweitzer's time. We are therefore better able to visualize an evolutionary continuity for Homo sapiens development, picking up and revitalizing previously lost and neglected aspects of human attributes and achievements, still preserved in pockets of the globe here and there. We are able to regard the intense focus on technological ingenuity, which has dominated the last 200 years, as a detour. And we can visualize that this detour can rejoin the earlier trajectory for human evolution, retaining those achievements which are helpful, but rejecting those which are not. My question now is this: have the developments of the intervening years My question now is this: helped by the developments of the intervening years, can we now accept Goethe's view that it is nature's intention, through the agency of humankind, to allow ethics to flower and bear fruit in this earthly garden? Can we now accept what Schweitzer found too difficult at the time, that this is a sufficiently firm foundation on which to build new structures for public life based on the ethic of reverence for life? in spite of all that is going on just at the moment, I would like to believe that we can. But what would it take for us as a species to actually be convinced of that? To take it seriously enough to recognize that this is our task, our contribution to life on Earth. So I have composed this little poem. Which I handed out on postcards to school children at a Fridays for Future gathering before COVID. Why not give a thought each day to the role we humans are here to play in the life of our evolving planet? As our adolescent ego comes of age, we'll play our proper part upon this stage as consciousness matures among us. Our common cause with nature will come clear. Instead of raping Mother Earth, we'll hold her dear. Perhaps this century or this millennium. And let's not be deterred by the seeming enormity of the task. All journeys have to start with a few small steps, even those that may take millennia.